today named Chuck Korte. He has been a long time member of the Life Raft group. He also was one of the first ones entering the clinical trial at Dana-Farber for STI 571, later to become Gleevec. So Chuck is here to share his story with us today, so you can hear the patient side of how this all began and how he's doing today. Chuck, you can begin.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Of course, this is fascinating, hearing the side from Dr. Dimitri, when I really have experienced a lot of that, but it's enlightening for me as well to hear that. But I think this is an incredible story. I mean, my whole life is different because of Gleevec, and I'm just incredibly grateful for that. So my cancer story started in '96, and like Dr. Dimitri said, it was Layne-Meyer sarcoma. So I had a tumor, I had a growth on my small intestine, I had surgery. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm a retired academic, so most of my medical work was at the University of North Carolina Hospital in Chapel Hill, a good medical center with a good cancer center. So that surgery gave me the bad news that I had cancer. And they said it's a rare kind of cancer called Layne-Meyer sarcoma, and not a very good cancer. And we're going to have to just watch it and see what happens. My story was that it basically came back annually. It was just right on schedule. Every fall it would come back. So '96, that was the first episode in the small intestine. In '97, it was back in the omentum. So again, I had stomach surgery. They took it out. At that point, they said, you know, you may want to consider chemotherapy, but it's not likely to help. So later that year, in actually '98, it came back in the liver. That was the third site for this cancer. And they said, you could try chemo, it probably won't help. I was willing to do anything. I mean, I was all gung-ho for anything that might help. So at Chapel Hill, I did sort of a traditional chemotherapy for Layne-Meyer sarcoma. It didn't help. The liver tumors kept growing. So I actually looked for a clinical trial at that point, and actually ended up at Dana-Farber. Dana-Farber did have a chemo clinical trial for Layne-Meyer sarcoma, which I did the summer of '98, and that didn't help. And so I eventually did have liver surgery. So again, right on schedule. It's fall again, fall of '98, and I'm having major liver surgery. I think they took at least 2/3 of my liver. And that was sort of kind of the low point of my cancer journey. That's when things just looked very, very bad. But I kept going, kept heading forward. And as usual, it came back a year later. It came back in '99. And on that occasion, it was treated with radio frequency ablation. Much, much easier to just go in and get that procedure. So that's what took care of it in '99. In 2000, this is now the 5th occurrence. It's back again in the liver. And here's where the things that Norman and others have talked about, the internet kicks in. Because I was on the Layne-Meyer sarcoma listserv. There was a listserv group. And folks there were saying that there's this marvelous new clinical trial if you have what they call a subtype of Layne-Meyer sarcoma. Get yourself tested. There's a specific subtype. And if you have it, you certainly want to get on this clinical trial because they're having wonderful results with this new drug. So I did. I contacted Dana-Farber. I think it helped that I'd already done a clinical trial there in '98. So I was sort of in their books more or less. I sent some original tissue from surgery, and they called back and said, yes, you have GIST and you're eligible. So I flew up to Boston and started I think in February, I started the STI 571, the clinical trial for Gleevec. And I was in the second group, I think it was the second group, and we were randomized to 400 or 600 I was randomized to 400. So I started 400 in February, and I was coming back monthly for checkups. And after 1 month, the cancer was still growing. And so they immediately moved me to 600 and came back a month later. And within 6 weeks, I had, I think, at least 70% reduction of the tumors in the liver. I was thrilled. I mean, that was just an incredible moment to get that kind of results. And what's interesting is that I found out that I was exon 9, which typically doesn't respond as well. But and so that they sort of figured that's why I needed 600. And I see Dr. Morgan and also Dr. Dimitri at Dana-Farber, and they always said, you know, it's possible that that progression we were seeing after 400 could have been false progression. We weren't that familiar with how tumors respond to Gleevec, and maybe it looked like things were getting worse when actually maybe 400 would have worked. So we never really knew whether 400 might have been okay. But the fact is, I, for some reason, am incredibly responsive to Gleevec, and they kept reminding me of that, and there were some genetic studies. So, but I stayed on 600, assuming that that's what I needed. And as soon as the drug was approved, that I was invited, along with those stage 2 people, to switch to the clinical study, not the clinical trial, but the clinical study. So I have continued on that clinical study with Novartis. So that means that I continue to get my care at Dana-Farber, following the Novartis protocol for that. And things have gone incredibly well for me. My side effects have been pretty minor. I think in the beginning, I am anemic, but I have a very normal life. I had a little nausea in the beginning, but that sort of didn't last very long. And so I very much lead a normal life, and I can't believe how lucky I am. So it's been 20 years. I've been on Gleevec for 20 years in the clinical study. I love going to Boston. I went to Harvard, so it's sort of a homecoming for me to be back in Boston. And I actually stay with friends who live within walking distance of Dana-Farber. So I have a very fortunate setup. And I almost feel like I live in Boston as often as I get there, and I'm very happy to go there. So I've done extremely well, and I think at one point I was told that, yes, I'm exon 9, but I'm an unusual exon 9, and that sort of, and I think that, I guess, explains why I'm so responsive to Gleevec. Starting about 10 years into Gleevec, my creatinine levels started rising, kidney damage, and so we've all been paying a lot of attention to that, watching that carefully. And it really did get to the point about 3 years ago where we all decided that we had to do something about this kidney damage. My creatinines were getting all the way up to 3, which is pretty high. So we made a decision to reduce the dosage. And they were quite, Dr. Morgan, they were all quite confident that given my receptivity, that I would do fine on 400. I was a little nervous, but we went with 400, and I'm doing fine. In fact, now we've dropped it to 300, and I'm still doing fine. And it really, I think it has helped the kidneys. My creatinine levels have stabilized. I remain very healthy. I feel fine. I think the protocol now has me coming back every 6 months, and I'm on 300 milligrams, and I never dreamed that 300 would be fine for me, in those long years of assuming I needed 600, but here I am doing fine on 300. And really the life raft has been critical. What people have said about that is so true. I think I went a year with that cancer diagnosis, never running into any other patient that had my kind of cancer. And it was so powerful when I finally did meet another Layar-Meyer sarcoma patient. And they told me about that listserv. And that was a game changer. Because remember, I heard about the Gleevec trial, not through doctors, but through that listserv from other patients. And so I'm a huge advocate of the power of being connected to other patients and what you can gain from that information. In fact, I think one of my best moments in the early days was when my Chapel Hill oncologist actually called me to get information about the clinical trial. They knew that I was doing a clinical trial, and so I really felt like that the Life Raft had just really was doing its job. So that's my story. I'm a very grateful, happy patient who loves coming to Boston, and Dana-Farber is such a marvelous place. I'm just very, very grateful and happy to. And my story always gives people encouragement, and I love sharing it because new patients just are thrilled to hear that people like me are still around. I'm 78 years old and very healthy. I'm glad of it.